At 3 in the afternoon, I was on the floor of my own living room, 38 weeks pregnant with twins, completely alone with my water broken and my phone just out of reach because my husband had locked the front door behind him and gone to the mall. Not to get help, not to call anyone, to carry his mother's shopping bags. And when he came home 4 hours later, arms full of boutique packaging and his mother's laughter still on his lips, he walked through that door and found something that made every single bag drop from his hands and hit the floor in slow motion. His face went the color of chalk. His mother stopped mid-sentence. And my father-in-law, the man who had told me hours earlier that labor wasn't that serious, stood frozen in the doorway and could not make himself step inside. What they found that afternoon did not just end a shopping trip. It ended a marriage, a family arrangement that had quietly been suffocating me for 3 years, and every single story Corvin had been telling himself about the kind of husband he was. But I need to take you back to the beginning because what happened on that floor was not an accident, and it was not just about one terrible afternoon. It was the final page of a story that had been writing itself slowly, line by line, since the week after my honeymoon. And I want you to understand every single word of it before we get to the part where I stopped being the woman who waited and became the woman who made sure they spent the rest of their lives living with what they chose. My name is Brexley. I grew up in a small town in Virginia where people fix things instead of replacing them. Cars, fences, friendships, and yes, marriages too. My mother canned tomatoes every August and kept a running grocery list on the refrigerator in her neat, looping handwriting. My father coached Little League on weekends and never once raised his voice inside the house. I was not raised in perfection, but I was raised in steadiness, and for a long time, I mistook steadiness for something everyone had access to. I assumed it was the default. I assumed the people I chose to love would operate from the same quiet, reliable foundation. That assumption cost me 3 years. I met Corvin at 24, at a mutual friend's backyard gathering on a warm June evening where the fireflies were out early and someone had balanced a speaker on a cooler and was playing songs that were already 10 years old. He was tall and quietly funny, and he had this way of listening that made you feel like the room had narrowed down to just the two of you. He remembered the small things, the name of the book I mentioned once in passing, the way I took my coffee, the fact that I hated cilantro even though everyone else seemed fine with it.
He showed up to things on time.
He called when he said he would. I thought I was watching a man's character. I was actually watching his audition. We dated for 2 years, and in those 2 years, I never once saw the version of Corvin that I would eventually live with. What I saw was careful, considered, and warm in the specific way that people are warm when they are working to be chosen. I was not naive. I had been in relationships that ended poorly, and I knew how to read certain kinds of dishonesty. But the performance Corvin gave was not dishonest in any obvious way. It was simply incomplete. And I did not know that until the parts he had left out started showing up one by one. We married on a Saturday in October when the leaves were turning, and the light was the particular shade of gold that makes everything look like it was always going to work out. The ceremony was small, just family and close friends, and the vows were the traditional kind, the ones with words like cherish and honor in them. I said those words like I meant them because I did. I believed he did too. The first crack appeared 7 days after we came home from our honeymoon. I was in the shower on a Sunday morning when Velma let herself into our house with the key Corvin had given her, without telling me he had given her a key, and rearranged my kitchen. Not reorganized with my input. Not tidied up as a favor. Rearranged.
Completely.
The mugs were in a different cabinet. The spice rack had been moved from the counter to a shelf above the refrigerator, where I could not comfortably reach it. The dish towels I had chosen, the ones I had picked out deliberately because I liked the pattern, were folded a different way and placed in a drawer I never used. The cutting boards were stacked in a new order. The coffee station had been relocated to the opposite counter entirely. I came downstairs in my robe and stood in my own kitchen and did not recognize it. Velma was sitting at my table drinking coffee she had made in my kitchen without asking, and she looked at me with the specific expression of someone who has done something they fully intend to justify. "Much better flow," she said. I looked at Corvin. He was leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who had known this was coming and had decided in advance not to intervene. "She just likes to help," he said when we were alone later. You'll get used to it. I did not get used to it. But I learned to absorb it, which is a different thing entirely, and a far more dangerous one. Velma was a woman who had decided, sometime long before I arrived, that her son's life belonged to her in a fundamental way that a wife was not fully entitled to reclaim. She called Corvin every morning before 9. She arrived at her house without warning on weekends and sometimes on weekday evenings, always with a reason that sounded practical, and always with an agenda that was not. She commented on my weight throughout the pregnancy. She criticized my cooking to my face and Corvin's cooking to me behind his back, as if her goal was to make both of us feel subtly insufficient, so that she remained the standard. She told me once, over dinner I had prepared, that the roast was dry in the way women say things like that, pleasantly, with a slight tilt of the head, so that responding feels like an overreaction. When Corvin and I decided to repaint the guest room to use as a nursery, Velma arrived the following weekend and stood in the doorway of the half-finished room and announced that we were doing it wrong. Not the painting technique. The color. The concept. The entire approach. Children need structure, she said, as though a paint color was a parenting philosophy. Yellow. Something bright. This sage you've chosen looks like a waiting room. I kept painting. Aldous, her husband, was the kind of man who had spent 4 decades perfecting the art of being present without being accountable. He did not start conflicts. He simply declined to stop them. Whenever Velma said something that crossed a line, Aldous responded with silence or with a short, mild phrase that had the effect of validating whatever she had just said. He was not a loud man. His particular brand of harm was quiet. The nod, the shrug, the look away at exactly the moment when looking directly would have required something from him. Charlotte, Corvin's younger sister, had grown up in Velma's orbit and had absorbed the behavior so thoroughly that she no longer seemed aware it was a behavior. She was 26, and she treated other people's serious moments as minor inconveniences she was tolerating out of generosity. She scrolled through her phone at dinner. She arrived late to things and left early. She had a specific way of looking at you when you were speaking, not quite bored, not quite dismissive, just slightly elsewhere. That communicated without words that whatever you were saying was not quite worth her full attention. Corvin loved his family in the way some people love a long-standing habit, not because it was good for him, but because the discomfort of interrupting it felt larger than the discomfort of continuing. Every time I raised a concern about Velma, he had a version of the situation that made my concerns seem like a misreading. Every time I asked for a boundary, he agreed in the moment and then quietly failed to hold it, and when I noticed, he had an explanation for that too. Not excuses exactly. Explanations. Careful, reasonable-sounding explanations that always ended with me feeling as though I had been slightly unreasonable for expecting the thing I had asked for. 3 years of that is a specific kind of tired. It is not the kind of tired that comes from dramatic events. It is the kind that comes from small, repeated compressions, from always being the person who adjusts, who absorbs, who decides that this particular hill is not worth the cost of the argument. I had been adjusting since the week after my honeymoon, and then I became pregnant, and everything that had been manageable became something else entirely. The pregnancy was classified as high risk from the beginning. Twins, my OB explained at the first appointment, came with a different set of considerations than singleton pregnancies, monitoring requirements, earlier intervention thresholds, a strict protocol around signs of labor. I was given printed instructions. I was given a timeline. I was told, clearly and repeatedly, that if I experienced active contractions or any other sign that labor was beginning, I was not to wait at home. I was to go directly to the hospital. Corvin was at that appointment. He heard those instructions. He nodded. I pre-registered at the hospital at 34 weeks. I packed a bag at 35. I had a folder in the kitchen with every form completed, every card copied, every number saved. I had done every single thing I was supposed to do. I was 38 weeks and 3 days on the afternoon, everything broke. It was a Thursday. I remember because the recycling truck had come that morning and I had been too uncomfortable to drag the bins back from the curb, and I had made a mental note to ask Corvin to do it when he returned from his lunch with Aldous. It was the kind of small domestic detail that sticks in your memory afterward. The recycling bin still at the curb, the ordinary morning, the way nothing about the day announced itself as the day. The house was quiet. Autumn had started settling into the neighborhood in that particular way, the afternoon light coming through the windows at a lower angle, turning the kitchen warm and amber. I was on the couch with my feet up, the hospital packet on the coffee table, the packed bag waiting by the stairs. I had been drinking water I did not want because my body had stopped registering hunger properly 2 days earlier. At 2:17 p.m., the contractions that had been vague and irregular all morning changed. The app one had been using since week 32 recorded them 5 minutes apart before I had consciously registered that the rhythm had shifted. By 2:43, they were 3 minutes apart. I stood up from the couch and felt the world tilt the way it does when your body has moved into a register your brain has not fully caught up with yet. Something had shifted from preparation into reality, from getting ready into this is happening right now. I found Corvin in the kitchen. He was standing at the counter eating leftover pasta cold from the container, scrolling his phone with the relaxed posture of a man who believed the afternoon had nothing planned for him. Corvin. Something in my voice made him look up immediately. The contractions are 3 minutes apart. The bag is by the stairs. We need to leave for the hospital right now. He set down the container. He reached for his keys from the bowl by the door. He looked at me, and for that one exact second, I want to be precise about this because it matters, for that 1 second, he looked like the man I had married. Alert. Focused. Present in the specific way he used to be present before 3 years of choosing his mother's comfort over mine had quietly eroded whatever that version of him had been made of. Then Velma stepped into the hallway. She already had her purse over her arm. Charla was directly behind her, phone in hand, expression set to her default mild absence. They had been in the guest room, the room that had been my nursery planning space before Velma had begun treating it as her personal accommodation, and neither of them had announced they were there. "Where are you going?" Velma asked, looking at Corvin's keys with a proprietary expression she reserved for anything in our house she had not personally authorized. "Brexley's in labor," Corvin started. "Perfect timing then," Velma said, cutting across him with the ease of a woman who had been interrupting people for so long she no longer noticed she was doing it. "Drop us at Hargrove Mall on the way. The leather sale ends at 5, and I've been waiting 3 weeks for that bag." The room did something strange in that moment. It went very still, the way rooms do when something has just been said that is too far outside normal parameters to immediately process. "Velma." I kept my voice even. "I am in active labor. These are high-risk twins. My OB has been very clear that I cannot wait. I need to go to the hospital immediately." She looked at me with the patient expression of someone explaining something obvious to someone slow. "First labors take hours.
You have plenty of time."
"Stop catastrophizing. These are not my first pregnancies," I said. "These are twins, and my OB specifically told us." "Doctors always say everything is an emergency," Velma said. "That's how they justify what they charge." Aldous appeared from the direction of the porch, hands in his pockets, squinting at me in the way he always squinted at things he had already decided were not his problem. "She can wait a few hours," he said, with the absolute calm of a man who had never once in his life needed someone else to make an urgent decision on his behalf. "It's not that serious." The words landed in the room and stayed there. I looked at Corvin. He was looking at his keys. I crossed the hallway and put my hand on his arm, gently, the way you touch someone when you're frightened and you need them to remember what they signed up for. "Corvin, please, look at me. We need to go. Right now." He looked at my hand on his arm. Something moved across his face that I could not read. Discomfort, maybe, or the particular expression of a person caught between two things they are not willing to lose, and choosing the one that has been louder for longer. He stepped back. "I'll just drop them off," he said, low and quick, like saying it fast would make it smaller. "It's 20 minutes. You'll be fine." "Corvin, it's 20 minutes. Louder now." Final. The tone he used when a decision had already been made, and what he needed from me was to stop making it harder. He reached past me and pushed the front door open wider. Velma walked through it. Charla walked through it without looking up. Aldous followed, muttering something under his breath that I did not catch and did not ask him to repeat. Corvin stopped in the doorway. He turned back once. One last look. And what he said to me in that moment, his pregnant wife, 38 weeks, standing in her own hallway while her body announced that the timeline was no longer negotiable, what he said was, "Don't you dare move until I come back." Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "Call me if anything changes." Not, "I know this is wrong, and I'm choosing it anyway." Just that. A command. Delivered in the voice he saved for moments when he had fully become his mother's son, and there was nothing left of the man who had once remembered how I took my coffee. The door closed behind him. The deadbolt turned. That sound, that small, clean, final click, is the sound I think about when people ask me when the marriage ended. Not in the lawyer's office. Not in the courtroom. Right there. At 2:51 in the afternoon on a Thursday in October in my own hallway, with the recycling bin still at the curb. I stood still for a few seconds. Then a contraction came that made every previous one feel like a rehearsal, a full, vice grip pressure that started low and spread upward and took the breath completely out of my body before I had a chance to prepare for it. I grabbed the wall. I breathed the way I had practiced, slow count in, slow count out, fixed point on the baseboard, let the wave crest and pass. The wave did not pass cleanly. It crested and immediately folded into another one. I made it to the living room. I lowered myself to the couch. My hospital packet was on the coffee table, 3 feet away, along with my phone and the water bottle I had knocked over earlier. My fingers were shaking in the specific mechanical way of hands that are operating on adrenaline when the rest of the body is otherwise occupied. I reached for the phone. I knocked it sideways. I tried again. It slid off the table and landed face down on the floor. I stayed very still for a moment and thought clearly about what I needed to do next. I needed my phone. The phone was on the floor. Getting to the floor from the couch was possible. I did it slowly, one careful movement at a time, until I was on my knees on the living room rug, and then I was reaching for the phone. And then I had it. The emergency call screen came up and I pressed it, and for one terrible second my mind went completely blank. The 3 numbers I had known since I was 5 years old simply gone, like a word that stops looking like a word when you stare at it too long. Then they came back. I called. The dispatcher answered on the second ring. Her voice was level and practiced in the way of someone who is trained to be calm precisely because the person calling is not able to be. I told her my address. I told her I was 38 weeks pregnant with twins, classified high risk, that my water had broken, that contractions were continuous, and that I was alone in the house and could not safely move to the front door. She stayed on the line. She told me not to attempt to stand, to stay on the floor if that was where I was most stable, and that paramedics were already on their way. She talked to me through each contraction, not with false brightness, just with steadiness, a voice on the other end of the phone that kept the room from going entirely silent. I lay on the living room rug with the phone on my chest, and I focused on the 2 heartbeats I had been listening to for 8 months, 2 steady, separate rhythms that had never once been impressed by anything happening outside them. I thought about the morning I had first heard them, at 12 weeks, the small galloping sounds that the OB had pointed to on the screen. I thought about the way they had both kicked simultaneously at 20 weeks, at exactly the same moment, as if they had coordinated it. I thought, we have come this far. We are going to be fine. The paramedics arrived 11 minutes after my call. The door was unlocked from outside. Our neighbor, Mrs. Ferrante, 2 doors down, who had our spare key and had heard the siren stop in front of the house and came immediately without being asked. I have thought about Mrs. Ferrante many times since that day. She did not know what was happening inside. She just saw an ambulance in front of a neighbor's house, and she came with a key. That is what showing up looks like. The paramedics assessed me quickly and professionally. One of them, a woman, older, with gray-streaked hair and the contained expression of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised, asked if there was family to reach. My husband took his mother to the mall, I said. She wrote something on her tablet. She did not comment. She did not need to. I was transported at 3:31 p.m. The twins were born at 5:48 and 5:53 that evening. 2 girls. Both arrived announcing themselves at full volume, the kind of immediate, outraged, full-lunged cry that makes everyone in a delivery room visibly relax because it means the lungs are functional and the baby has already decided the world has some explaining to do. My OB was there. The full nursing team was there. A neonatal specialist stood ready at the side of the room because of the high-risk designation, gloved, prepared, watching. The complications that could have materialized did not. Both girls were healthy. Both were placed on my chest within minutes of arrival. I was not alone in that room. I want to say that clearly because the afternoon had handed me something I had not expected. Proof that alone is not a fixed condition. It depends entirely on who you ask to show up. The people in that delivery room had never met me before that day. They showed up completely. The people who had known me for 3 years locked a door and went to look at handbags. At 7 p.m., the hospital social worker came to my room. Her name was Theodine, calm, unhurried, with the practiced neutrality of someone trained to ask hard questions without making the person feel interrogated. She asked about my support at home. She asked whether I felt safe. She asked whether what had happened that afternoon was a single incident or part of a longer pattern. I sat with that last question for a moment. Then I told her the truth. All of it. The kitchen. The commentary. The 3 years of small compressions. The deadbolt. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she placed a card on the side table and told me that no decision needed to be made tonight, that there were resources available whenever I was ready, and that what I had described was significant enough to document. I kept the card. Corvin arrived at 8:14 p.m. I know the exact time because the nurse logged it in the chart with a precision that felt deliberate. He walked in pale, wide-eyed, with the energy of a man who had been frightened enough to feel temporarily remorseful. Velma stayed in the doorway. Aldous remained in the corridor. Charlot did not come at all. Corvin looked at me. He looked at the bassinet. 2 small faces, eyes closed, entirely unbothered by the chaos of their own arrival. His expression did something complicated. I didn't think it would happen that fast, he said. I held his gaze for a long moment. I know, I said. That's exactly the problem. That night, I let him hold my hand. I was too exhausted for anything else, and there were nurses in the room, and Theodine's card was on the side table, and I had just delivered 2 children alone. I was not ready to be sharp, but I had already begun, somewhere behind my exhaustion, to think with a clarity I had not had in 3 years. The first week home was surface-level calm. Corvin overcorrected the way people do when they understand they have made a serious error and are hoping that visible effort now can quietly rewrite what happened then. He woke for the 2 a.m. feedings without being asked. He handled grocery runs. He maintained careful distance from Velma in a way that would have been meaningful 2 years earlier. It was too late to be meaningful now. I was not angry in an explosive way. I had moved past that into something colder and more organized. I was clear. I knew exactly what I was doing and why. On day 4, while both babies slept in the afternoon and the house was quiet, I made a phone call from the nursery with the door closed. A family attorney. 45 minutes. I asked questions, and I listened to the answers, and I took notes in the small spiral notebook I had used to track my prenatal appointments. When I finished, I placed the notebook in the kitchen drawer next to the pre-registration folder, and I sat for a moment in the rocking chair in the half-light of the nursery, and I felt something settle. Over the following days, I formally requested my complete hospital admission records, the dispatch log, the paramedic report, the attending physician's timeline, the delivery notes. Every document was time-stamped with institutional precision. The gap between my emergency call and my husband's arrival at the hospital was recorded in black and white. Medical records do not soften things. They do not explain or interpret. They simply state what happened and when, and in this case, what happened, and when told a story that could not be revised by anyone. I also put together a written account of the previous 3 years, documented carefully, without embellishment, with dates wherever I could confirm them. The kitchen rearrangement. The ongoing commentary on my medical care. The dismissal of my OB's explicit instructions. The specific events of the afternoon, including direct statements I could recall verbatim. I was not constructing something dramatic. I was recording what was already true. 3 weeks after we came home, On a Wednesday evening after the babies were down, I sat across from Corvin at the kitchen table and told him I was filing for legal separation. The attorney had already been retained. The paperwork was underway.
He stared at me.
Brexley, I know what I did was. I need you to listen, I said. Not explain. Just listen. He closed his mouth. I called emergency services from our living room floor because you locked the door on your way out, I said. I delivered our daughters without you in the room because you were at Hargrove Mall. The hospital record reflects that. The dispatch log reflects that. The paramedic report reflects that. None of those documents can be adjusted. I don't need an apology. I need you to understand that I am not the woman who remains in a marriage after that, and nothing you say in this kitchen changes what those records say. He had explanations. Several of them. He had a version of the afternoon that was more complicated than I was representing. He had a version of his relationship with his mother that involved pressures I had never fully appreciated. He had, for each of the 3 years I described, a counter-narrative that repositioned every incident as something other than what it was. You are an adult, I said when he finished. You made a series of choices. This is the consequence. The separation was filed the following month. The attorney incorporated everything, the medical documentation, the written account of the behavioral pattern, the timeline of the afternoon as verified by institutional records. What had previously been a private domestic situation became part of a formal legal filing, which meant that Velma's interference, Aldis's dismissal, Charlot's indifference, and the specific choices Corvin had made on that Thursday afternoon in October were no longer things that could be managed over family dinners or explained away in private conversations. They were on record, permanently, in a format that the legal system does not allow anyone to quietly revise. Velma called twice after the filing. I did not pick up. She left voicemails. I forwarded them to my attorney, who documented their content and added them to the file. Aldis said nothing, which surprised no one. Charlot sent a text that I screenshotted and forwarded as well. The legal process was not fast, and it was not easy. It took months, and it required a steadiness that I did not always feel naturally. There were nights when the exhaustion of 2 newborns and an ongoing legal proceeding and the grief of a marriage ending sat on my chest like physical weight. I will not describe any of that as simple because it was not. But I had 2 daughters sleeping in a coral-painted nursery down the hall. I had looked at their faces the night they were born. Their complete newness, their absolute indifference to everything that had surrounded their arrival, and I had made a decision about the woman they were going to grow up watching their mother be. That decision held on the nights when nothing else did. The settlement was finalized 7 months after the twins came home. I kept the house. I kept primary custody. Corvin received structured visitation on a fixed schedule with clearly defined terms that left no room for the casual renegotiation Velma had always treated as her inheritance. The terms were binding. They were specific. They were the opposite of every vague, deniable boundary I had tried and failed to hold for 3 years. The house became something different. I repainted the nursery, not the sage that had looked like a waiting room, not the yellow Velma had prescribed, a deep, warm coral that caught the morning light and held it. Both girls reached toward the walls from their cribs like the color was something worth touching, and I took that as the kind of sign that explains itself. My parents came back and stayed close. My friend flew in from Oregon and spent 2 weeks sleeping on the couch and waking for 3 a.m. feedings without being asked. The neighbor 2 doors down, Mrs. Ferrante, became one of the most reliable people in our lives, and she still has a spare key. Things rebuilt. Not back to the before. The before was the version of my life that required me to constantly adjust my reality to match someone else's comfort. Forward. Into something that required less management and returned something genuine. People ask me, now that enough time has passed for the story to be a story rather than an open wound, whether I regret the marriage. I think about it honestly every time because it deserves that. What I regret is the pattern. The 3 years of absorbing things I should have named directly. The small repeated adjustments I had categorized as compromise when they were really just accommodation of someone else's ease at the cost of my own. I had been doing that since the week after my honeymoon, in a kitchen I no longer recognized, while Velma sat at my table and called it better flow. What I do not regret for a single moment is what I did with the afternoon they left me on that floor. I did not wait. I did not make myself smaller to survive it. I got my phone off the floor, I made the call, and then I told the truth. To the dispatcher, to the paramedics, to the doctor, to the social worker, to the attorney, and eventually to a legal record that no one involved will ever be able to revise or walk back or quietly explain away at a family gathering. Every institution that came into contact with that story documented it accurately. And Corvin and Velma and Aldous and Charlot and the leather handbag and the 5 o'clock sale, they're in that record too.
Permanently.
Officially. In a format that exists regardless of whatever version of events they choose to tell themselves. The girls are growing up in a house where their mother did not stay on the floor and wait for someone who is never coming back. They will not grow up believing that is what love looks like. That is the part one would choose again, without hesitation. That is the part that matters. If the person who is supposed to protect you chose something else instead, at what point do you finally decide that you are the one who gets to make the call?